is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello everyone, welcome to Issues of Faith. I am Ben Hall. Today we're talking about death. It's part of life, but it's something that many of us here in certainly North America avoid talking about quite often. Halloween is a holiday that is recognized, and in Mexico, something that is recognized, celebrated, is Dia de los Muertos. That's what we want to talk about today. Happy to have with us Edward Wright Rios, an associate professor of history at Vanderbilt. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you look at this notion of how maybe we're uncomfortable talking about this.
Right.
What is Dia de los Muertos? How does it take on this issue?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I have to say, it's one of the most beautiful holidays to witness. In that if you go to, especially in small towns in Mexico, small villages, and sometimes in big cities, on this day, November 2nd, or really a couple days before, you'll see everybody cleaning up the graveyard, polishing everything up, sweeping, cleaning, bringing in fresh flowers. The flower vendors all over town are chocked full with new flowers, wreaths, and then people go out and they decorate these. And then in some places, individuals will all go with their families to the graves and spend the entire night. Candles, they will bring offerings of food. Sometimes they'll sit there and sing favorite songs to the departed. It's really quite extraordinary and beautiful, and in a way, it's really, I think for anyone, it's hard to go to something like this and not see how wonderful this is as a recognition, in a sense, of our own mortality and of the sort of nearness of those who have gone on before, and in a way that Americans or North Americans are not very comfortable with, to actually sit in the graveyard for a long time.
So is this a sad time? Is this a celebration, a holiday, a happy time, or is it a sad, depressing time?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go to Mexico and you go to a funeral in Mexico, Mexicans are just as likely to show the kind of grief that you would see at a North American funeral. Of course, people miss their departed family, and they celebrate them. In Mexico, you still do vigils for the dead. People will stay up all night with the corpse present, which was not very common in the United States. But Dia de los Muertos, where you actually go to the cemetery and where you sort of ritually decorate and celebrate and clean up the grave, in a sense, it's not so much a sad event as a marking of the departed, and ideally, I think, for at least the way it's supposed to work, you're supposed to be praying for them as well and praying for their soul.
Is it a recognition that death is part of life, that it is right there, it's something we will all experience, and maybe we are too reluctant to begin that kind of conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a sort of, North American culture has been more completely, shall I say, modernized and sanitized, if you will. The dead go to a place for the dead, and we don't see them anymore. The living stay with the living and try not to think about that place anymore. You see, I mean, the way we separate ages, older people supposed to go to places with older people, younger people with younger people. We have laws to keep these things separate sometimes. In Mexico, that transition from a, quote, traditional world where these things were ever present to a kind of post-modernity is not as clear and clean, shall we say. So yes, there, death is very much, people don't say, I'm doing this because death is present. It's just assumed that this is part of life. You have to go take care of your dearly departed. You have to go think about them. Usually the graveyard in a small town is not far. You would walk past this a few times a week. You would go to funerals there relatively frequently. So these are not things that, it is not the same sort of sanitized separation that we have here in the United States.
Is this a Catholic holiday? I mean, its tradition comes from what, would you say?
So the tradition here is definitely a medieval Catholic holiday. This is part of a long tradition of the sort of the full span of the liturgical calendar, where this would encompass, of course we know Christmas, then there will be Lent, there's all sorts of different feasts for important saints. Depending on the village that or town that you visit, you essentially will have a slightly different liturgical calendar for every place. Traditionally, Catholic towns in Mexico and other Catholic countries, this would be true in Italy or Spain, many parts of France, will have their patron saint. So the patron saint's feast would be very important for that locality. The nearby neighbors, maybe there's a miraculous image of Our Lady of the Rosary, and her feast would also be celebrated, and people from the region would arrive for that. There might be a shrine community nearby that would also sort of shape the liturgical calendar there, and within that would also be this period of All Saints' Day, November 1, and Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, on November 2. Mexico, I think, also has the added complexity that the Catholic liturgical calendar is essentially laid down upon indigenous ritual calendars. So depending on the indigenous group, and Mexico has many different indigenous groups with their own complex mortuary traditions and notions of ancestors. So you will have, in some places, unique flavorings to Day of the Dead because of this overlay of a Catholic culture deeply rooted in medieval traditions over top of indigenous traditions of care of the dead, of also a agricultural cycle. So Dia de los Muertos for some communities falls in an important part of an agricultural ritual cycle, and hence that can give it an almost New Year's feel as well.
There is a celebratory aspect to it. There are some costumes.
Yeah.
You see some of that, but there's also the notion that there's a responsibility of those that are alive to pray for those who have passed. Is that accurate?
I think that's the deep tradition. So one thing that has been lost to most, I would say, Western Christians is this notion of purgatory. So Dia de los Muertos, if you look at it historically, it's often referred to as Dia de las Ánimas, which is Day of the Souls, which was where you were supposed to go pray for the souls who were in purgatory, with that idea that enough prayer would shorten their time in this limbo space, and they would finally ascend, as you'll see in the old paintings, ascend that ladder out of the sort of cool flame of purgatory into the bliss of heaven. So this was this idea that you are supposed to be thinking about these individuals, and of course the idea is that there are many thousands of souls in purgatory, and you could help them through your prayers, intercede, and give them less time in that space. So that's part of that duty. I think there's also a long-standing tradition or popular belief that the ancestors sort of represent the family in the beyond. So just as you might help them, maybe they could help you in some way, put in a good word for you, perhaps. Again, this is very much not part of an official orthodoxy, but very much a part of popular belief.
And here, and everywhere, death is so tragic that I think we think, okay, let's move on, let's move beyond it, and not revisit it on a yearly basis. How would they handle the death of a child? How does that work on this day, Dia de los Muertos?
Well, Mexicans feel the same kind of crushing grief that we would feel with the death of a child. The same kinds of absolute crying anguish at a kind of unexpected death of not just a child, of course, of an adult. The same kinds of tragedies and feelings come through in a funeral in Mexico. There's less, I would say, there's more of a tradition of handling the body, having the body present, seeing the body. And for some people, I think that actually helps them start to cope with the grief, to actually see the person without their personality present as it used to be when they were alive. But Mexicans do have a tradition. I think this is probably older than Mexico itself, at least in this way that we understand Mexico as a nation. A notion of the angelitos, the little angels, the sort of the children that die before they can sin, if you will. So this idea that soul ascends more rapidly to heaven. So you will see that talked about. I think North American popular culture can tend to talk in those terms as well, although without that Catholic tradition of saints and angels that you do see. But I think, again, Day of the Dead is going to be a place where certainly if someone has lost a child recently, you would see probably if they built, some people who do a home altar, you would see them put a picture of that child perhaps, a picture of the grandparent departed on the altar, perhaps some flowers around them. Those sort of celebratory, I think, shrining traditions, you might call them. Mexicans have been doing them for centuries, and I would say that in the United States we're starting to borrow them.
How is it that it is such a big holiday in Mexico and it has not been such a big holiday in the United States? How is it that there's such a difference there?
Well, I would say there, what you're seeing is the presence of Catholicism, right? If you go to Mexico, still the vast majority of Mexicans are Catholic. So here you have a country that at least historically had the sense of everyone being part of the same religious culture, even though there's quite a lot of variation in that. In the United States, we have a more secular public culture. It's the ideas that, you know, the Lutherans do what the Lutherans do, the Mennonites have their thing, and Catholics are seen, at least historically, as a sort of ethnic cultural enclave. You'd have the Italian Catholics in one neighborhood in Toledo, the German Catholics in a different neighborhood in Toledo, perhaps. You would see these different, and it would be less of a shared public culture. And then I think those immigrant groups assimilate into a broader, what we might call sort of North American Christian culture, and tend to drop those things that seem out of step. So I would be willing to bet if you could go to an Italian family in 1910, you probably would see them celebrate a version of All Saints' Day and Day of the Souls afterwards. I don't know how many Catholic Italian families sustain those. Lots of Mexican families don't sustain this either. If you go to an urban middle-class neighborhood in Mexico, or upper class, you don't see much of this kind of celebration.
But this has now been, well, we have to take a break, but all right, we'll talk about this coming back. But this has even been embraced by the Mexican government. They like this idea, which is a difference, I guess, in our two countries. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back, continue our discussion, be back right after this.